We're considering Cataclysm in the land of Israel. More particularly, since last time, we've been thinking about Cataclysm in the future. And in particular, the earthquake that we've been considering is the one described in the book of Ezekiel Chapter 38, which I think we can be fairly confident is still a future event. Last time was part 1, and we called it the day before Pentecost, if you remember. This is part 2, and I felt it would be appropriate to call it the day after Pentecost, and you'll understand why as we get into the talk. We looked at this briefly last time. There is this expectation that Israel is overdue for a massive earthquake. This was as reported in much of the media, but here is Haaretz. And the Bible does tell us about an earthquake that is coming. It says, when Gog attacks the land of Israel, this sets the scene for the earthquake. My hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. So this is something that we have to prepare for. The government of Israel is helping us do it by providing leaflets, which I talked about last time. But I'm not going into all of these things in detail, but I just want to very quickly remind ourselves of the conditions that would have to pertain prior to this earthquake, as described in Ezekiel chapter 38. It's a nation. All of this is taken from Ezekiel, the first verses, the early verses in Ezekiel 38. They're pretty black and white. They're pretty stark. They don't take a lot of interpretation. It speaks of a land that's recovered from war, and my contention is that in order for there to be peace, at some point in time, Hamas will have to be defeated. It's interesting to note that the fact that they weren't defeated for Hamas is a victory. We have to accept this. But there come a time when they have to be defeated. How long, it says in the Jerusalem Post, will the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas last? There's already been provocation with incendiary balloons. Will it last for years or months or even days? We don't know. The interesting thing, and Diana pointed this out to us, I think you might have noted it, what she sent round. While Hamas were firing rockets even into Tel Aviv itself, the niece of Hamas's chief was actually being treated. Now, of course, this never makes the media, but it is a fact that the healthcare that is incredible in this country, and I can't stress it enough, is also available even to members of Hamas. You don't hear that on the news at all. But the fact is, it's a land that's recovered in war, and the text is quite explicit. All are living in safety. And it mentions it in more than once place in Ezekiel 38 and 39. This is Jew and Arab. There are riots going on in Acre today. But one day all the population will live in safety. And they are, as described, a peaceful and unsuspecting people, living without walls. We talked about it. Rich in livestock and goods. Prosperity is coming to this land. It's beginning and it will continue. Do you remember we talked about the Leviathan gas field? It's only just beginning, folks. Prosperity will help to build the bridges between Jew and Arab in this country. I anticipate it. Prosperity will help. And the other interesting thing in the early verses in chapter 38 of Ezekiel is that the nation apparently is living in the centre, at the centre of the land. And we looked at this map, didn't we? The boundaries which are described in two places in the Tanakh of the land of Canaan. One in the Torah and one in the Book of Ezekiel, which is interesting because it's looking into the future. And as I described last time, it is true, therefore, if this land is bigger than what they have at the moment, they're living at the centre of the land, and of course that land ultimately has to include the land of Lebanon, which is a separate nation. It's in a very fragile state, but one day it will be part of the promised land, because the land of Canaan is the portion that will be inherited by Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. We read Psalm 105 together last time. So here are the conditions, and it is true that all of these conditions have to be met before Gog attacks the land of Israel. Now, we may have earthquakes before this event. I can't rule them out, of course, but most certainly when Gog attacks the land of Israel, the Lord himself declares that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. We have to prepare for it. What's going to happen when that day comes? I'm looking forward to it personally, because a lot of other things are going to happen too. Now, the invasion is very interesting, because this is what the Lord says. This is in Ezekiel chapter 39. I will turn you around and drag you along. That's very interesting, isn't it? It also speaks about a hook in the jaw of Gog, dragging him to the mountains of Israel. So there appears to be a reluctance almost on behalf of the invading forces. I will turn you around and drag you along. I will, there's lots of I will so in the book of Ezekiel. I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. On the mountains of Israel you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you. Now, when we're thinking about Gog, because this is what is being described in the book of Ezekiel, we talked about the Gog Accords. We had the Abrahamic Accords, but we also talked about the Gog Accords. And here we see three characters that are on the stage today. But as I said last time, I'm not anticipating this Gog-Magog invasion for many years. So we'll have different characters on the stage, but maybe these nations will be represented. But the question remains, who is Gog in all of this? Now, this is what it says in Ezekiel 38, verse 15. You will come from your place. The Lord is speaking to Gog here. You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses. A great horde, a mighty army, you will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. Now, they're coming from the far north. That's a fact. There's also a description that they're coming on horseback. Does it mean that in a modern context? I don't know. I'm not going to rule it out, because the Bible speaks of horses both in the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, and in the Book of Revelation. So you can't rule it out. I don't want to rule it out, but there's a model that we maybe not realise when we're considering Gog-Magog. And the model that is in the minds of the prophets when they describe this invading force is the Scythian Hordes, which were a very violent warriors on horseback with shields and helmets. Actually, particularly in the days of Alexander the Great, they were possibly his greatest enemy. And it is interesting to realise that Alexander viewed Caucasus Mountains as the barrier between the Scythian hordes and his army. And if you search the term Alexander's Gate or the Caspian Gates on Wikipedia, for example, you will see some information. The suggestion is that Alexander, it's somewhat legendary, but Alexander created gates within the Caucasus Mountains to keep the Scythian hordes away. In fact, his greatest battle, apparently, was against the Scythian hordes, the Battle of Jaxartes in 329 BC. So this imagery is in the minds of the prophets before and in some cases after Alexander. But is there a modern context for this invading force? Well, they're coming from the far north. That's the point. Let's just not worry about the horses at this moment in time. But it seems to me that it is appropriate to regard a Russian confederation in the days to come as what is described as Gog for the Ezekiel 38 and 39 event. They're coming across and through the Caucasus. Now, I'm putting Russian Confederation because we need to recognize that there are quite a number of Islamic countries like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan as Uzbekistan who were part of the Soviet Union, and they might yet comprise part of this Russian Confederation. They're not alone. There are nations with Gog. And this is what it says in Ezekiel chapter 38 from verse 4. Persia, I think we understand Persia. Okay, that's not a surprise, is it? Persia has been a historical enemy, as we will see later, of the Jewish people. Cush, where is it? This is an ancient name, almost certainly south of Egypt. Could be Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, places like that are described in an ancient name of Cush, Put, perhaps west of Egypt. Then, of course, you've got some other very strange names. These are all archaic names, and we can find them within the Tanakh. Almost certainly these names are found within the modern state of Turkey. So you've got Turkey, Russia and Iran. That's what we had in that previous, but we've also got other nations too. But, very significant, folks, who isn't involved? We talked about it last time. And I think this is really, really interesting. Egypt is not involved in this invasion. I think that Egypt is going to play a very, very important role in the things that happen in the days ahead with respect to Gaza and Hamas. There's already reports that Egypt itself will move into Gaza. Now, if that were to happen, and I hope that it does, then Hamas could be dealt with in a different way. Of course, the other nation amongst several others that are not involved in this is Saudi Arabia, and we talked about that last time, Sheba and Dedan. They're shocked that Gog is coming to invade the land of Israel, which is now at peace. But we talked a lot about the mountains of Israel. On the mountains of Israel, that's Gog and all its forces, you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you. And we talked about the mountains of Israel last time, particularly those, to begin with, that are contained within the West Bank. And that's interesting. We won't deal with it in any great detail, except to say that Jerusalem is in the heart of this. mountainous region. And of course the psalmist tells us, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people both now and forevermore. Now I turn to the book of Zechariah, because Zechariah chapter 12 is a very important chapter. Aspects of it have been fulfilled. An aspect of it was fulfilled at the crucifixion, according to the Apostle John in his Gospel. I think that many of the battles and the wars that Israel has faced since its establishment have been partial fulfillments of Zechariah chapter 12. But if you read the whole chapter within its context, it is looking into the future, where every aspect of that prophecy will be fulfilled. And it is a military conflict that is taking place. Now, this is speculative on my part. And there will be nations that put Judah and Jerusalem under siege. It's not everything is coming from the north. Some of it is coming from elsewhere, and Jerusalem will be under siege. And I've suggested these three nations as a possibility, but that's speculation on my part. However, what is certain is that whatever this siege will be, and whoever is involved in it, the Lord himself says, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations that are putting it under siege. We need to look at Zechariah's prophecy within the context of what is taking place in the book of Ezekiel, because I think the two things are very closely linked together. This is what it says in Zechariah chapter 12. Now, it's interesting to note every word. Every word is important. Every word is the truth. On that day, isn't this interesting? I will strike every horse with panic, and its rider with madness. So horses are spoken about here within this prophecy, declares the Lord. I will keep, this is God, he's watching over his flock like a shepherd now. I will keep a watchful eye over the house of Judah, but I will blind all the horses of the nations. Now this is really significant. Then the leaders of Judah, might not be Bibi, but it will be the Prime Minister at the time and his government at the time. Then the leaders of Judah will say in their hearts, the people of Jerusalem are strong. What, because of the IDF? No, not because of the IDF. Because the Lord Almighty is their God. Something's going to happen here which is incredible, which will begin to open the eyes of the Jewish leadership. I love this bit. Then Judah will say in their hearts, the people of Jerusalem are strong, because the Lord Almighty is their God. Something's happening in the heart of the people of Israel, or particularly the leadership. Now, what does the Lord say in the book of Ezekiel? I will remove from them their heart of stone. Israel has a heart of stone today, and will give them a heart of flesh. So what's happening in Zechariah 12 is the beginning of this process. What does he also say in the book of Ezekiel? And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. The nation is beginning to move into the new covenant. When God softens their hearts, or their hearts become soft, and God, because they've become flesh, the Lord says, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. So what happens next in Zechariah? Well, this is the context. This is the context of what's going to happen next. On that day, this day, I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. We'll talk about it more next time as well. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which is both Jew and Arab actually, a spirit of grace and supplication. So we've already seen their hearts have become flesh. God pours out his Spirit upon all flesh. And what happens then? They see someone. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. Of course, this happened at the crucifixion. But in its context, prophetic context, it will happen again in the days to come in a bigger way. Needs another Pentecost. This is the day after Pentecost, after all. What does it lead to? We just read the text in the book of Zechariah chapter 12. It leads to national repentance and mourning. And it goes on. You can read, the words are absolutely clear cut. The last verses in chapter 12 of Zechariah. The nation is in mourning and is in seeking the Lord and coming to repentance. Now, my favourite verse in the Tanakh, I think, amongst many, is the next verse. This is what will happen on that day. On that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. I love this verse. I love it. Because I'm going to highlight two words. Do I live in the Holy Land? I do not live in the Holy Land. It is filled with sin and impurity. It's a fact. But on that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David, that's the Jewish people, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from sin and impurity. This took place on Thursday the 3rd of June. This was the Jerusalem Pride March with the rainbow flags. This was in Haaretz about a month ago, which is a rather sarcastic headline. Shush! Don't tell evangelical supporters of Israel, but abortion there is legal, and often it's free. There are reasons for it, which is another talk. This is a very interesting map. Actually, it's a very old map. It's 2003. But you see the percentages of pregnancies that end in abortion. This is a really interesting map. You can see the percentages on the right-hand side. Look at the blue regions where abortion is not so prevalent. They're the Palestinian regions. Israel has a very free abortion policy, even up to late term. In fact, the headlines suggest that 40,000 women have abortions in Israel annually. This is sin and impurity. The fountain has to be opened to cleanse the nation, and it's going to take time. This is what it says in the book of Ezekiel, in that overview that we read in chapter 36. It's totally consistent. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. That's what it says. It's going to happen. It's the word of God. It's the truth. Eventually Israel will be the Holy Land. Eventually. because the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the land of Israel will do what Jesus said it would do. When he comes, he will convict the world of guilt in regard to sin and righteousness and judgment. This is going to happen when God pours out his Spirit of grace and supplication on the nation. That's why they go into mourning and lamentation, eventual repentance. Can't wait for it. Can't wait for it. But we go back to the mountains of Israel. You will fall, that's Gog, you and all your troops and the nations with you. Now, we also looked at the mountains of Israel that are in the Golan Heights, perhaps as the major scene. Remember the open fields that we looked at last time? I found this map, which I really like. I really like this map because it shows the mountainous regions of Lebanon. You can see the relationship between the Golan Heights and Lebanon itself. Several talks ago now, when we talked about the Amos earthquake, which is spoken about here in Amos, the first verse of the book of Amos, the prophecy of Amos was given 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah. We talked a lot about it. I found this map and I used it, which also shows something of the fault line that runs through Lebanon, which is an extension of the Dead Sea Transform Fault. And I was able to put the two maps together, and I was very happy to do that because it looks like a really good map there. And you can see the Mount Lebanon range, you can see the anti-Lebanon range, you can see the fault line running through and going on actually into Turkey. You see the position of Damascus. And we talked about the Amos earthquake when we considered that in one of the earlier talks, and I mentioned this paper that was published about the Amos earthquake. Steve Austin I've been able to get to know quite well. An extraordinary Middle East seismic event of 750 BC. And here's the abstract of the paper. So this is an academic publication, and I'm just going to highlight two parts, really, so we don't need to read it all. The epicenter of the Amos earthquake was north of present-day Israel, probably in Lebanon. The earthquake was at least magnitude 7.8, but likely was 8.2. Now, that's a massive earthquake. My expectation, folks, is that the coming earthquake will be greater than this one. It will have a similar epicenter, but will actually be even more than 8.2. That's big. That's a great earthquake in the land of Israel. This was in the paper, which is a map of Israel, which is laid on its side so I could get it on the slide. And here are different places that were shown to be damaged in that Amos earthquake. And we asked the question last time, what about Jerusalem? What happened there? Who's this? Do you remember? It's Josephus. And the testimony of Josephus speaks about the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. I'm not going to show much of it, but these are the important bits. In Book 9 of Antiquities of the Jews, Chapter 10, Stanza 4. In the meantime, a great earthquake shook the ground, and a rent was made in the temple, and the bright rays of the sun shone through it. So the temple, even though the epicenter of that earthquake was in Lebanon, the temple was affected by the earthquake. And of course we showed this picture quite a number of times, where you see the earthquake fault line running so close to the temple, which has been significant in the past, it will be significant today, and it will be significant in the days to come. What do I anticipate? Now, this is speculation, folks. If that earthquake is around 8.5, with its epicenter in Lebanon, I think the Islamic edifices on the Temple Mount, which have been damaged by earthquakes throughout history, as we spoke about in previous talks, I think they will be demolished. They'll come crashing down. That's what I anticipate. It's part of the Islamic disempowerment that will take place. I believe this. Only time will tell. The question is, will there be another temple on this Temple Mount? Then. I still do not think so. And I'll explain why in my next talk. I don't think the Jewish people will want to build an old covenant temple when they're entering into the new covenant. That's what I believe, but only time will tell. Anyway, going back to Ezekiel's earthquake and my beautiful map I put together. This is what it says. It's going to be a big one, folks. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, and every wall, need to qualify that a bit in a minute, will fall to the ground. And that is interesting because we spoke about this 2 talks ago, the Damascus earthquake, which took place in 827 AD. And as I mentioned at the time, the city was largely destroyed with 20,000 fatalities, but actually it was very widespread, this earthquake. It didn't just affect Damascus. Mosul, which is considerably further away, and also Antioch, which is further north, there was very much damage and people lost their lives. This is what it says in the book of Isaiah. This has to be fulfilled one day. It's been destroyed as it was in the 9th century, but it was rebuilt. There is a day coming when it will no longer be a city. There will be, I wouldn't like to think how many fatalities. But actually, some people will go to the rescue when that day comes. I'm sure of it. It will be the IDF. And the people of Israel will be going to the aid of the people of Damascus in that day. This is speculation, folks. The IDF will be on the Damascus Road. Someone else was on the Damascus Road when he met the risen person of Jesus. And it says this at the end of Ezekiel, which is also one of my favourite verses in the Tanakh. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. Some of this will happen on the Damascus Road, I think. I could be wrong. But of course, the prophecy of Ezekiel speaks about Gog's demise. And this is a very interesting verse in chapter 38. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. There will be internal conflict. I'm going to highlight it. Every man's sword will be against his brother. This confederation of nations cannot stick together if they're in the middle of an earthquake. And they'll turn on one another. That's what it says. These are the words that it says in the book of Ezekiel. And I add these words. As in the day of Midian's defeat. What on earth are you talking about, Geoff? What are you talking about? We need to look at Isaiah's prophecy now in chapter 9. Now, this is how we know these verses off by heart. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. We read those in our services of 9 lessons and carols at Christmas. But we do something really interesting. I've often wondered about it. We jump to verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This is what we read at Christmas time, isn't it? The question is, what happened to verses 3, 4 and 5, which we never read at Christmas? We need to look at these verses because they're so significant. This is what verse 3 says in Isaiah 9, the bits we miss out. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. This is describing what happens in Ezekiel 38 and 39, folks. The harvest. What harvest? I don't know, but I think it's Shavuot, which is Pentecost. It's also known as the Feast of First Fruits. That's why Pentecost was Pentecost, but there's a greater Pentecost to come. And if you read Ezekiel 38, 39, it's all about plundering the plunderers. And of course, we read this last time, Isaiah 26, it has to come. It has to come. You have enlarged the nation, O Lord. You have enlarged the nation. You have gained glory for yourselves, and you have extended all the borders of the land. So when they're going to the Damascus Road, they're going into Lebanon, which will be in terrible condition after the earthquake. And they'll rebuild it, become part of the promised land. You have enlarged the nation. And this is the next verse. This is verse 4 of Isaiah chapter 9. And this is where we get the term, for as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. The day of Midian's defeat. What do we remember? The story of Gideon. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp of the Midianites, of course, to turn on each other with their swords. It's exactly what it says in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 21. Every man's sword will be against his brother. So it's as in the day of Midian's defeat. And then verse 5, the bits we can't read at Christmas time. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. This is Ezekiel 39, folks. We'll come back to it in a minute. I just want to say one other thing before we do that. Isaiah's prophecy has to be fulfilled in its entirety. And it will happen during the events of Ezekiel 38 and 39. The people walking in darkness, who's that? That's the people of Israel. They're in darkness. They will have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. For, this is what the nation will say, for to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. Not Bibi, not Naphtali Bennett, but on the shoulders of Yeshua, of Jesus. And Isaiah's prophecy will be fulfilled in that day, completely, totally. When they look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one who grieves for a firstborn son. It's going to be a big shock when that day comes. When God says, I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. 3 passages in 3 different prophecies, in 3 different books, but it's the same face that will be seen. It's the face of Yeshua, of Jesus. It's spiritual revelation, I believe. I want to be living when this day comes. I'm not sure I will be, but I hope I am. So let's go back to this verse 5 in Isaiah 9. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. This is exactly what it says in Ezekiel Chapter 39, verse 9. Then those who live in the towns of Israel, I think I highlight it, yeah. For those who live in the towns of Israel, so the towns of Israel are still there, folks. Because the Gog falls in open field. I think that's really significant. Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up. The small and the large shields. Remember the Scythian Hordes? The bows and the arrows. Will that be reflected in a future military event? I'm not sure. The war clubs and spears. For 7 years they will use them for fuel. I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means. Time will tell. But it is exactly what it says in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 5. So let's think now about the aftermath of Gog and Magog. The land has to be cleansed, made clean, physically clean. That's what it says. These are very precise words. On that day, I will give Gog a burial place in Israel, the valley of those who travel east towards the sea. It will block the way of travellers, because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. So it will be called the Valley of Hamon Gog. These are very precise words. For 7 months, the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse their land. All the people of the land will bury them, and the day I am glorified will be a memorable day for them, declares the sovereign Lord. I hope I'm alive on that day. I think I'll be too old to be involved. But men, there's full employment here, folks. Men will be regularly employed. These words are so precise. You can't really misunderstand them. Men will be regularly employed to cleanse the land. Some will go throughout the land, and in addition to them, others will bury those that remain on the ground. This is a major, major event. At the end of 7 months, they will begin their search. So there's 7 months of initial burial, very precise words, and 7 years to identify the remains and to gather all of the plunder. I put in this picture because I just wonder whether biological and chemical weapons will be involved in this. It can't be nuclear. It just can't be nuclear. But biological and chemical weapons could be involved. And this is what it says. Very precise words. As they go through the land, and one of them sees a human bone, he will set up a marker beside it until the grave diggers have buried it in the Valley of Hamon Gog. Where's that? Also, a town called Hamona will be there, and so they will cleanse the land. It's going to take 7 years. 7 years of physical cleansing. Remember the Hebraic mind? There's no difference between the physical and the spiritual. They go hand in hand. They're part of the whole. 7 years of physical cleansing, I think, will be paralleled by 7 years of spiritual cleansing. We read it on that day. A fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. This is a spiritual cleansing that will be paralleled by the physical cleansing of the land. As they go through the land and one of them sees a human bone, he will set up a marker beside it until the grave diggers have buried it in the Valley of Hamon Gog. Also a town called Hamona will be there, and so they will cleanse the land. The question is, where is the Valley of Hamon Gog? I think I know. The fact is, it's not located on the mountains of Israel. It's not. It's in a valley near to the town of Hamona. And here is the word Hamona. It basically means multitudes. It's the multitudes of Gog. That's basically what it means. But actually, it's all Hebrew words are built on a root of 3 letters. And I'm going to highlight those. If you take out the vowel sounds, you're left with Hey, Mem, Nun. How would you say that, do you think? Haman. I think this ties the event of Gog and Magog also with an attempt by Haman in Persia, Iran, to destroy the Jewish people. I think. If you think about the valley where the bones will be buried, this occurred to me as I was preparing this talk. Are we talking about a reversal of fortune here? Let's think about the burial site. We showed this terrible picture, which is Bergen-Belsen. What I didn't talk about last time was Babi Yar, where 37,000 Jewish people were killed by the Nazis in 2 days, and all buried in a valley, which is now Babi Yar. But I thought of this verse as well, which is in Jeremiah chapter 30, which I think is a very significant chapter. But all who devour you will be devoured. All your enemies will go into exile. Those who plunder you will be plundered, with Ezekiel chapter 38, 39. All who make spoil of you, remember the word spoil, I will despoil. But I will restore you. This is God speaking. It's another I will. I love it. About Israel. But I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord. Why? Because you are called an outcast, Zion, for whom no one cares. This is a fact. The Holocaust is an open wound for this people in this nation. It is. One day this wound is going to be healed. And I think Ezekiel 38, 39, which is a reversal of fortune, will go some way towards it. Hasn't answered the question, where is the Valley of Hamon Gog? So let's think some more about the burial site. The fact is, it's in Israel. That's what it says. This is the verse. On that day I will give Gog a burial place in Israel. It's in Israel. In the valley of those who travel east towards the sea. What does that mean? Well, it's important to realise that traditionally we got it all wrong. Because if you look up Hamon Gog in Google, you find pictures like this, which suggest that Hamon Gog is actually in the land of Jordan. It's not right. It just isn't right. The Valley of Hamon Gog has to be in Israel, because that's what it says. And it says this very strange thing. It will block the way of travellers. That's what it says in Ezekiel 39:11. It will block the way of travellers because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. Now I've got this map, because I think I know where it is. I have to say it's speculation on my part, but I think I know where it is. This is a map of nearly where we live. I'll just highlight a few places. Those who travel east towards the sea. What does that mean? Oh, here we go. Those who travel east towards the sea. The road is the 25 road. I mean, maybe you can't believe that I'm telling the truth, but this is what I believe. Those who travel east towards the sea. What's the sea? Well, it's coming from Dimona. That's interesting. And it's going to the Dead Sea, or at least the southern end of the Dead Sea. And it's blocking the way of travellers. What on earth is that? Oh, maybe it's the road to Eilat. And if we look at the name Dimona, it's not a million miles away from the word Hamona. Now, this is speculation on my part, absolute speculation on my part, but it's near Hamona. And I think it's about here. That's what I think. Now, if we step back to a bigger map, and I can put two places, Dimona, which we've already looked at, and Arad, we're not very far from it, I think the Valley of Hamon Gog is here. Why? That's the question. I think the Dead Sea Transform Fault has something to do with it. Obviously, the impact of the earthquake described in Ezekiel Chapter 38 is going to have a profound effect all along the Dead Sea. Maybe it opens up a valley even. It's also the lowest place on the earth, which I think could be really significant when we think of the burial of Gog in the future. There's another reason. I wonder if you could guess. I never thought of this before preparing this talk. What do you think the other reason might be? Why this is an appropriate place to bury the remains of Gog and all his hordes? I think it's this. Salt. And this is a picture at the southern end of the Dead Sea, and this is an interesting little article. The longest salt mine in the world discovered. The cave runs for 6 miles. It's all salt, mountains of salt in this region, the Dead Sea. In fact, we have to go there when you come on your trip next year, maybe. The salt will be used as a not so much a preservative, but as a disinfectant, I think. Could be wrong. But I wanted to put this in. Remember Lot's wife? Jesus spoke about it towards the end of time. The one who turned back and was turned into a pillar of salt. It will block the way of travellers. If that's the case, a new highway will be constructed, or will have to be constructed. And the book of Isaiah talks about it. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. The Assyrians will go to Egypt and the Egyptians to Assyria. A trans-Israel highway. The Egyptians and the Syrians will worship together. In that day Israel will be a third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. And I put in this picture, which is the Trans-Israel Highway today. You see it in blue. It's the 6th road. And it will be extended. In the south it will need to be extended because it's got to avoid the Valley of Hamon Gog. And it will be extended through Lebanon. And these words will then be fulfilled. The whole of the Middle East will be changed by Gog and Magog. I believe it. Islam will be disempowered by Gog and Magog. Here's Arad, which isn't far away. Actually, the 6th road has actually revolutionised our travel across the country. So a new highway will be constructed, but if we consider the results of Gog's demise, there will be international results. Because in Ezekiel 39 it says this, I will send fire on Magog and on those who live in safety in the coastland. So Magog is everywhere where Gog has come from. Fire will be sent. And those who live in safety in the coastlands, and we spoke about that last time, and I just throw up this picture of the ring of fire. It's going to be devastating in the world as a whole, and we'll talk about that more next time in the next talk. Of course, the results of Gog's demise in Israel we've already spoken about, but specifically in Ezekiel chapter 39, I will make known my holy name among my people, Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, which it is in Israel. And the nations will know that I, the Lord, am the Holy One in Israel. So what's the holy name? It's Yeshua. It's Jesus. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God, for though I sent them into exile, this is a reprise of what it says in Ezekiel chapter 36, among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. And of course we read this before. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. Last verses of Ezekiel chapter 39. Now this is where it gets perhaps a little too much, but I end the talk with this. We have to go to the prophecy of Joel. We have to. Joel's prophecy in chapter 2. Of course, Peter quotes part of it on the day of Pentecost. I know that. But in its full context, it's still to be fulfilled. And in 2 places in that chapter, it begins, and in verse 15, it says, blow the trumpet in Zion. And I show this picture again, because I'm linking it to the day of Midian's defeat. Blow the trumpet in Zion, declare a holy fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the people, consecrate the assembly. Actually, if you know the story of Gideon, there's a selection process. There's thousands of potential warriors joining Gideon, but only 300 are chosen. Many are called, but few are chosen. There's a selection process. We remember those that lifted up their hands and drank from their hands were the ones selected. When I was thinking about this, I just felt that when we talk about a selection process, we need to refer to the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is read in Shavuot, just by way of passing. But Ruth said to Naomi, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. So if we go back to Joel chapter 2, it's interesting, verse 17. Let them say, spare your people, O Lord. Do not make your inheritance an object of scorn, a byword among the nations. Why should they say among the peoples? Why should they say among the peoples, where is their God? Just highlighting two groups of people here. Let them say, spare your people, O Lord. And there are others that say, where is their God? And I wonder whether these two groups are personified in the person of Ruth and the one who turns away, and the selection process that will inevitably take place, that is going to divide the Christian church in days to come. But in response to the prayer of those that stick with the nation, this is what it says, verse 18 and 19. Then the Lord will be jealous for his land and take pity on his people. The Lord will reply to them, I am sending you grain, new wine and oil, enough to satisfy you fully. Never again will I make you an object of scorn to the nations. What does it say next? What's the next verse? What is it? We never talk about this verse. It's incredible. The next verse, verse 20. This is God's response. I will drive. It's amazing. We never read this in Joel chapter 2. I will drive the northern army far from you, pushing it into a parched and barren land, with its front columns going into the eastern sea, and those in the rear into the western sea, that's the Mediterranean. And its stench will go up, its smell will rise. This is God's response to the prayer, spare your people, O Lord, by those that cleave to this nation, as personified in the person of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is read at Shavuot, Pentecost. So I put that against here, because it's fulfilled in Ezekiel chapter 39. It is fulfilled. That's why we don't know what to do with this verse. We never talk about it in Joel chapter 2. It goes on, verse 25, I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten, the great locust and the young locust, the other locust and the locust swarm, my great army that I sent among you. Then you will know that I am in Israel, that I am the Lord your God, and that there is no other. Never again will my people be shamed. The next words, and afterward. I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. So if I'm still alive on that day, I'll be dreaming dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. Which is what it says in Ezekiel. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. It is, after all, the day after Pentecost. And next time, what are we going to do next time? Well, it'll be after we meet face to face. Can't be before. We will think about perhaps our final talk in this series, which will be about global catastrophe, because this is something to anticipate, and indeed the final battle when Jesus returns.